Live. Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very, very many reasons. What this is just an open conversation. I'm here, I'm talking with you. Until and unless I have more information to be more specific, you are just a figment of my imagination. I'm doing my best to figure out who I think might be here and what you might be interested in hearing and how would be an effective way to communicate things. But if you are here and willing and able, you are invited, if even encouraged, to participate in the chat by putting things, questions, thoughts, comments, whatever, into the chat. That gives me more information about who you are, what you're interested in, how I'm coming across. We're just communicating with one another. Like any conversation, when one person is paying attention to what the other one is doing, then what they observe impacts how they think and feel and behave. The things that I observe you all do changes what I'm thinking and feeling and doing. And theoretically, if you're paying attention to me, then the things I'm saying change what you think and what you feel and what you do. We're just interacting with one another. That can take the form of question and answers. That can take the form of just, I was going to say, shooting the breeze. There we go. That's the non-curse word version. I'm a licensed therapist. I work with a therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy with people who are in the state of Illinois. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. We do remote services for therapy as well, but only for people who are in the state of Illinois, even though it's remote. What else? Yeah, okay. Makes me anxious to even think of something to contribute to this. A conversation can be so many things. It really can. And, that's a good reminder of the other thing that I usually will put out there is don't worry about staying on topic. I'm going to be talking about whatever I'm talking about. I don't wait for prompts and questions and things. I'm not going to sit here in silence. I'm just going to be talking about whatever, or I might be talking in response to something someone said. If you all are going to wait around until there's a break or a pause, that's not going to happen. And you don't need to make sure that you're keeping your topic, your comments or questions or whatever on topic. That's a specious way of looking at things anyway. Don't worry about whether things are tangents or rabbit holes or whatever. We go where we go. And what's most important is that I'm responding to and addressing whatever it is that you all are saying, which I am very aware of. Telling people that there's no right or wrong thing to say oftentimes not only doesn't make it less anxiety inducing to participate, it sometimes makes it more anxiety inducing. We like the comfort of being able to think that there is a right or a wrong thing to say, even if we're nervous about whether we're doing the right or wrong thing. So I'm not saying that to reduce anyone's anxiety or help anyone to feel more comfortable necessarily. If it has that effect, that's great. But I'm saying it just to be clear and specific that this comes up in therapy generally, but even more broadly than talking about therapy specifically, this comes up in change. When human beings are intentionally, we change every moment to moment, context to context, right? In small and subtle and unnoticeable ways, every moment is different from the moment immediately preceding it and the moment immediately after it, no matter how I'm using moment as opposed to second or minute, because no matter how small you divide that up, it's constant change. Most of the change, though, is not change that is like intentionally aimed at, right? We're not having conscious thoughts of, I'm going to try and change this thing most of the time. Intentionally changing is a very difficult process. It's difficult to even identify something that you would like to intentionally change in the first place. It's difficult to identify what you would like to change it to. It's difficult to go through the process of figuring out what can be done in order to make those changes happen. And even if you know all that, it's still difficult to go through that process of doing those things, right? Like as an example, and a silly one, I like to pick ones that are going to sound silly to illustrate the point. I can say with some confidence that, if I want to be able to hit a golf ball with a driver twice as far as I can currently hit it, which, I don't golf, so I'm sure it's not very much. I can say, well, I know that how I would do that is by go practice, right? Go to the driving range or whatever and do it over and over. Maybe hire a golf coach or instructor. Even knowing all that is still difficult, right? And I don't just mean difficult to commit to that process, but like, even if I've committed to it, I still got to go there, do the thing, put in the effort. My hands and my arms and whatever will get sore. I'm spending money and etc. Change is difficult. So anything where people are intending to help you change, and yeah, that's therapists, but that's all kinds of things, because there's things on the physical side. There's coaches and teachers and all kinds of things. Is a process that's difficult. It's costly. So I'm not aiming, and people shouldn't generally be aiming to make it as convenient and as easy as possible, but as effective as possible. And it needs to be convenient and comfortable and easy enough that you can continue to do it sustainably. But if it's only convenient and easy and comfortable, no change is happening. If it's pushing too much, too hard, too fast, then no change is happening because it's not sustainable. We're looking for that balance in between. Sitting and watching the swells. Oh, hi, Dad. Sitting and watching the swells at Laguna Beach, I'm drawn to the question of the influence of the moon and tides on the human population. That's a fun one. That's interesting. I've heard you talk about motivation before versus just doing something. Can you talk about that? Oh, another good question. Both fun. I'll say this about the moon and tides, because this is just like fun speculation stuff for me. Oh, I was just getting very distracted at work thinking of the backstory for a necromancer wizard who is in therapy trying to better accept his angsty years obsessing over necromancy and use what he learned during that time to do some good in the world. Well, I like that one quite a bit, actually. Has some real good, real world metaphorical applications. I'll say the moon and tides one very quickly, because this is just fun speculation on me. I will say that the moon, and it seems to me that there's obvious reasons for this, occupies a very prominent role in human mythology, like throughout the years. I do sometimes, especially when I'm camping or outdoors at night, I do sometimes like to think about how different it must have been for like the majority of humans throughout history to be spending so much time under the open sky, including at night. And especially without knowledge of like what the world is or what the sky is or what stars are, or any of that stuff that we have scientific explanations for at this point. Like I think about things like, what if a comet all of a sudden appeared in the sky? Like, yeah, you wouldn't notice it because you look at that sky every night. It would be a big deal. Like tracking the phases of the moon, which to me is something I barely ever notice. Like every once in a while I might say like, oh, what a beautiful full moon or whatever. But it's not that big a deal. But if I was outside all the time, including at night, then yeah, I would very easily notice the moon changing from one to the next phase, whatever. I like to think about that stuff. I'll say there's certainly a lot of speculation about the position of heavenly bodies and how they affect all kinds of things for humans, whether that's our own personalities and developments or like various aspects of our world. It's fun to me that tides is like something that scientifically at this point is supported. So in a sense, like if we heard it phrased in a different way of like ancient humans used to think that the moon was exerting a pull on the oceans and moving water around the earth and whatever in different ways, would be like, oh, interesting. But that's like a legit thing that we actually believe in. There's all kinds of scientific evidence that is what is happening. So that's cool to think about how we're connected to something that's so far away and it impacts us. I like how people have thought about the full moon in the past. The phrase lunatic and lunacy comes from that same root word, luna. Luna is the word for moon in Latin. I hope I'm not wrong about that, but fairly confident in that. And the idea that the full moon is like when people go crazy, whatever. Again, if you think about it from the context of living a life where if it's a new moon at night, you don't really have much light to see by and can't do very much after the sun goes down. And if it's a full moon, you can accomplish as much as possible after the sun goes down. So there are reasons to think that a full moon would be a special thing where people would engage in all kinds of stuff that they wouldn't otherwise be doing, or engage in those kinds of things more during a full moon. And I'll say no, never mind. I won't say that. I'll move on. Motivation. Actually, I might tie this in a little bit with, his name is Josh, and I love him, the necromancer. Certainly there are ways I could see myself in that character. Um, According to Google Translate, it's Lunae, Lunae is the word for moon. Root, though, I guess I could say confidently that it's the Latin root, the root word. That's interesting because I never learned Latin and I don't actually know the rules of it. But just from pattern recognition, I would assume that that is a plural word, Lunae, A-E. But apparently there's lots of interesting stuff for me to learn about Latin. Minus the angstiness and whatnot. Certainly I can draw correlations for myself about taking things that I learned in my teenage years and trying to apply those things in ways to do good in the world. I've been very explicit for a long time, long before I was a therapist. I was doing executive functioning coaching or academic coaching work for many years before going back to school to become a therapist. I've been very explicit about that my experiences as a student influenced and informed my decision to do the things that I'm doing and the specifics of the work and how I go about it. My experience, particularly as being in language that other people would use, without spending a bunch of time getting into my particular way of using language around this, I would be described as a intelligent or bright or gifted student who struggled with executive functioning, right? It's not that unusual of an archetype of a student that learns the material and aces the tests and does really well, but doesn't do the homework, doesn't, follow deadlines and show up on time, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm saying not minus the angsty part, because for me that I quite enjoyed my childhood. And hey, Dad, you're here. I had a great childhood. Thank you. Thank you for your work on that. Not that I didn't have my issues. Everybody has their issues, and I had my struggles and the things that I suffered with. But I had a great childhood, a great teenage years. I was fortunate enough, despite my executive functioning struggles, He was a shorthand. He has a period of grief where he made some ill-advised choices. I'm thinking in his mid-20s or so. Okay. I was fortunate enough to attract attention from certain people because of test scores and other things, and had the opportunity to go to a very fun and fancy and prestigious boarding school in Singapore for a while on scholarship. And I was very lucky. I certainly have, we can identify many types of privilege that would be involved in this, but also many types of support. And I was very lucky to be able to kind of make whatever decisions I wanted to make, and things ended up working out in the long run, even though there were short-term pitfalls. What kind of executive functioning skills have worked for you? That's a wonderful question. So let's talk about motivation and executive functioning skills. This is maybe, I think, the kind of the first and most obvious thing that stuck with me from that time, that just was rattling around in my brain, and I couldn't let go and couldn't move on from the idea of what difficulty it's causing people, is around this idea of motivation. Executive functioning, I'll define it real quickly, because people tend to talk about executive functioning skills or strategies, and we're thinking about like proper note taking or good ways of keeping a planner or managing a task list and things like that. And those are all wonderful and helpful things. And I do a lot to help clients with those things, because that would all fall under what we would technically call offloading. Anything that you're doing, any tool or system, anything external to you that reduces the workload on your executive functioning, which are cognitive skills. So that's offloading stuff. And I'll be happy to talk about it. More specific questions and contexts are helpful to get more specific rather than broadly, but I'll start with broad stuff unless I get that. The technical definition of executive functioning is the hypothetical set of cognitive processes that allow a person to control their own behavior. Meaning, each of us individually can observe what it is that we think, our conscious intention. I know that I'm saying, I'm going to do this homework. I'm going to go to the gym in the morning, whatever it is. And then we and everyone else can observe our behavior. I did the homework, or I didn't do the homework. I did go to the gym in the morning, or I didn't go to the gym in the morning. When what we do, when our behavior, the observable thing that we do, matches up with our conscious intention, we call that executive functioning. That worked. When it doesn't, we call it executive dysfunction. And what we're talking about is if right now everybody who's listening to this says, I'm going to give a thumbs up, give me a thumbs up, and you do that. We know the conscious intention, I'm going to give a thumbs up. We observe that what happens is a thumbs up. What happens in between, we don't know. I can't observe it, you can't observe it, nobody knows. We know something is there because I did not consciously instruct particular individual muscles to, like, I couldn't even name what those muscles would be. I'm not aware of any conscious effort being put towards sending electrical signals to different things. But that stuff is happening. So this is why it's all hypothetical. What we're doing is we're theorizing about, I know what the intention is, I know what the behavior is, and we're theorizing about what is the stuff that must happen in between. It has to happen. What must that be? And so when things don't end up going the way that we want them to, theoretically something that happens in between the intention and the execution, something in there went differently than we would optimally want it to go. And depending on what kind of specific thing we're talking about, that's going to guide our theories in particular directions. One that is almost a lot of the time when people are talking about executive functioning, they're actually referring to one specific subset of what we would call executive functioning skills, one particular executive functioning skill. Very commonly, that skill is initiation. But typically, each different person talking about executive functioning is struggling with some particular thing, and that's the thing that they're grouping up as the total, like that's all executive functioning. Kind of like the same way that somebody who plays basketball would say they're an athlete, and somebody who plays football would say they're an athlete, and they're not talking about the same thing, even though what each of them is experiencing does fall under the category of athletics, right? So it depends on what specific things we're talking about. But probably the most common one that I hear people talking about falls under what we would call initiation, which is defined as the ability to get oneself to begin on a task that they've identified wanting to begin on. I set an intention to do a thing, getting myself to actually start the process of doing that thing is what we're talking about initiation. Someone I know with ADHD gets frustrated that they aren't accomplishing the task they want to till night because they keep getting distracted by other tasks during the day. What's going on there? Such as writing 2 pages backstory for a new D&D character instead of finishing my presentation for work. Okay, good. I like all these things. I might ask for some more specifics as we go along so I can give more specific thoughts and feedback. But to me, what we're doing right now, all I can do here is share language with you, right? Help to theoretically help you understand something in a different way, help you to come to different conclusions about what things might be worth trying next. And then whatever happens will happen, right? Maybe those things will work, maybe they won't. This is kind of a metaphor for executive functioning broadly. We're coming up with our ideas of what we think will work. We try it, we see how it goes or not. That to me is the first step of understanding how to improve executive functioning issues, is understanding that this is a thing where it's a black box. We know what goes into the box. We know what comes out of the box. What's happening in there, we don't know. So we just come up with theories. If you think of it kind of like a mathematical function, right? If I put a 2 into this box and out the other side comes a 4, then we could say, oh, maybe in that box, it just adds 2 to whatever number is put in there. Maybe in that box, it just multiplies by 2, whatever number is put in there. Maybe in that box, it just squares whatever number is put in there. In order to be able to determine what it is, we then got to try to say, like, okay, let's put a 3 in there and see what comes out the other side. If it's a 5, okay, I feel pretty good about it's adding something. If it's a 9, okay, it seems like a square. If it's a 17, it's like, oh man, I have no idea. None of my theories covered that. So it's something much more complicated than I thought it was. It must be, right? This is like orders of magnitude more complicated because we can't even be sure that what's happening inside that box is consistent. It could be that it changes every time, but it's still useful for us to come up with our theories about what is going on. And that both of these questions, what skills have worked for you, is a question in pursuit of that, like what might work for me. You have some reason to think that whatever I'm going to share that worked for me might be something that might work for you or for people that you're thinking about wanting to support in this. Asking me what's going on there with this person, again, is theorizing about what might be happening on the box. So the most important thing to know is the answer we're trying to get, or the question we're trying to answer is, what is worth trying next? That's the answer we need. What's worth trying next? Not what is happening, what will work, Neither of those are fully answerable questions, even though they can be useful questions to attempt to answer. The only question we can answer is what is worth trying next. And we're trying to get an answer to that as quickly as possible because this is an iterative process. If you have an idea off the top of your head, try it. If it works, great, keep doing it. If it doesn't work, great, move on and try something else. Not initiating something, forgetting to do it, not getting yourself to be able to do it, doing it once or twice, but it doesn't continue. Those are all versions of it didn't work large scale or long term, right? They're not different things. This goes back to the motivation that hopefully we'll get to in a second. So knowing that whatever's going on, we have to come up with our idea of what's worth trying next. Theorizing about what's happening in that box, what's going on in the executive functioning. Maybe there's initiation issues, maybe there's working memory issues or goal-directed persistence or whichever sub-skill we want to look at. We come up with those theories in order to help us answer, so what's worth trying next? In other words, if we don't know what to try, then it's worth being like, well, what do we think is going on here? If this is happening because of X, then we would be able to do Y, and that would resolve the problem. So now we've answered what's worth trying next. Let's try Y. This is an iterative process, and things that work will not work in all contexts. Please don't fall for the trap of thinking that if something works for you for some short period of time and then stops, that means it doesn't work. It means it worked under a certain context and then didn't work in a different context as defined by how we're talking about it. And know that if something works for you for a bit of time and then stops working, it is entirely possible that there was something about that bit of time that made it work that will come back around at some other point, or that some other changes can be intentionally made that makes it work again. One of the most common traps is trying something, it works for a little bit, and then after 2 weeks, my system falls apart and it doesn't work for me anymore. And I log that away as something that didn't work, and now I got to go try to find something completely new instead of trying to look at, well, what was it that changed that might have made it take that from it was working to it wasn't. Said with humor, I'm having trouble focusing for a lot of reasons this morning, and executive function is definitely in there. So getting to the root of the executive functioning difficulties and coming up with a solution that directly addresses what that root is. That's the theory if we're going that route of looking at what are the root causes here. That's the point of analyzing executive functioning. We don't need to analyze executive functioning to to improve these things. But if we're going down that path, it's the same way that in therapy, if we're going down the path of exploring past experiences or whatever, it's because we're trying to answer this question of what is worth trying next, and we're struggling to come up with something that's worth trying next. So we're saying, let's theorize about why it might be happening. Once we settle on a theory that seems useful for us to explore, then we can come up with an idea of what's worth trying next. If it's an initiation problem, we try this. If it's whatever. So I'll give you some guidance here on how to go about in some specific helpful things on that. But that's why I'm starting with the very first most important thing is you're going to just have to try. Think about it like any physical skill, right? If we're talking about you're trying to learn how to make free throws in basketball. If somebody comes in and was saying like, hey, I got real struggles with making free throws, what do I got to do about that? Like, how do I get better at that? What that means is they've already identified what they're attempting to accomplish. The ball goes through the hoop, right? While I'm standing at this line, I throw the ball with my hands and it goes through the hoop. They've made some attempts, noticed probably some successes, but we don't know that for sure. Definitely have noticed some failures. And now they're wondering about what can they understand, what different ideas can they get. Now, in the case of learning to shoot a free throw, it's pretty clear and obvious for most people. It's like, you just got to keep practicing. It's good to come up with different ideas about specific changes to make, learn from others, but you just got to keep doing it. That is still the case with executive functioning. You have to keep trying, and it doesn't matter how good you get or how many solutions you come up with or how much good advice you have found. There are going to be attempts that end in failure. You got to try again. And what we're looking at is not eliminating all failed attempts. We're just trying to reduce the frequency of the failed attempts, or maybe either the frequency, the duration, the intensity, or the negative impact of those things. We're trying to shift that stuff. So start from knowing it is something you're just going to have to try over and over and over and over and over, and you'll get better as you go along. So we need to start with stuff that's going to make it so that it is not scary to try things, even though they might fail. And a lot of the ways that executive functioning is discussed works against that, because we talk about it as though it is some internal knowable characteristic, like executive dysfunction is a disease that we can identify the mechanism of what's going on and there's some known treatment. And none of that is the case. But if we think of it that way, what that means is every time I attempt something where executive functioning is involved and I fail at it, I then am interpreting my failure as evidence that I am a person whose executive functioning is bad in some way, which means as I predict the future and the rest of my life, that I'm likely to continue to fail at things that require executive functioning, which, by the way, is everything. Literally moving a muscle requires executive functioning. So then I feel terrible, right? Like that means the rest of my life is going to be terrible if I'm stuck at executive functioning. If we work that backwards, that means that trying things that involve executive function becomes very high stakes for me. I don't want to try anything unless I'm very confident that it will be successful, because if I try something and fail, that makes it seem like everything's even worse and my life is going to be terrible. These are separate attempts and you have to approach it. This is play. And I understand that there are many specific instances where things that are going wrong that we can talk about executive functioning and how it's involved might be very high stakes. There might be things going on that are very important. But the higher the stakes, the less we can make attempts, the slower we iterate, come up with new ideas, get feedback, and so on. This is about quick feedback loops. Try something, see what happened, come up with an idea, try it again. This is a hard and fast rule of human learning, human development, anything change. The more you do something, the more information you have about that thing, gained through experience, which equates to the more mastery you have over the outcome of that thing. Period, point blank. The more you do something, every time you do something, you get closer to mastery of that thing, right? Vice versa, there is no way to get closer to mastery of a thing without any attempt. Whether an attempt is a success or is a failure doesn't actually correlate very much to how quickly you master the thing, just how many attempts you make. Guaranteed, 100% guaranteed, the best free throw shooters in the world have missed more free throws than I have ever attempted in my life by hundreds of times, right? Failing a lot is something that is necessary on the path to mastery. So we're trying to play and make the stakes low. And if it helps, then we want to start by looking in low stakes places to play around with it. What that means here is a lot of the time when people are coming talking about executive functioning things, they're talking about like academic and occupational things, my school or my work. A lot of times other things too, but a lot of the time it's those two things. And those two things are things that are very high stakes for people. And I can attempt to make them lower stakes, but that's not going to come across very well, generally speaking. So what we want to do is try and identify something else, somewhere else, where we can work on developing executive functioning skills in a lower stakes environment. And yeah, that does mean things like maybe we're working on executive functioning skills in prepping for a game of D&D, or in how you're approaching whatever your particular hobby is, or in planning and executing on the plantings you want to put on your front porch, or whatever. So very first thing we want to look at, we already know some stuff that you struggle with, right? We wouldn't be talking about it if you didn't have good awareness of what you're struggling with. The thing that we haven't gotten as much information about is what is the stuff that you are good at? And that also means what is the stuff you enjoy? 3 things that go together: enjoying something, doing something a lot, being good at it. It's not that you start with one and then get to the other. It's a cycle. They just all go together. And the opposite is true. The more you hate doing something, the less frequently you do it, the worse you are at it. Those stuff. If I'm bad at something, I don't enjoy it. If I don't enjoy it, I don't do it a lot. If I don't do it a lot, I don't enjoy it. I don't blah, 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 right? So we want to start in a place where we're enjoying something so we can play around and iterate there before jumping to the high stakes stuff. Otherwise, it makes everything worse. Now, doing things is how you get better at them, period. But there are many variables that impact how quickly you get better at things. How, like, return on investment per attempt, how quickly do you improve? And the 2 things, there's been a good amount of research on this. There are many variables, but the 2 that are identified as the most impactful, the most beneficial is 1, mindful practice. Mindful practice means I am identifying not only the aim that I'm trying to come out of this with, what I'm aiming at, but I'm identifying a particular strategy or tactic that I'm going to attempt and then monitoring for the success or failure of that attempt so that I take in the feedback and go from there. If we're talking about shooting a free throw, just to keep running with this same metaphor, right? That if I say, okay, today I'm going to try doing it, keeping my elbow tucked in to my chest when I shoot, and I keep my mind on that and I'm watching, does this work or doesn't it? Not if it fails, that means I'm bad at it. If it fails, it means maybe this strategy isn't working for me and I need to adjust. That's mindful practice. The other is expert feedback, individualized expert feedback, meaning somebody else who has more knowledge and expertise on it is observing you as you're making your attempts, giving specific feedback and suggestions on your specific thing. So some of this, I'm doing my best, is kind of like if I were a tennis coach and people are coming to a stream saying, like, how do I get better at tennis? There are general things I can give, but none of that is going to be nearly as effective as working with somebody one-on-one who can say, here's the specific thing. Now, in this format, you can still give me specific information. And the more specific information you give me, here is a thing. This is an example, right? Like, here's a thing that I am struggling with. I keep meaning to do my homework right after I get home from school, and I don't end up doing it until 9 p.m. Or I intend to work on my music at night. Every day I go to work and I get home and I want to write and record stuff, and I just keep failing to do that. The more specifics you give me, the more helpful information I can give specifically. Oh, Lunae is of the moon. Interesting. So let's look at a specific here. Someone I know with ADHD gets frustrated that they aren't accomplishing the task that they want to till night because they keep getting distracted by other tasks during on the day. What's going on there? We want to understand executive functioning as an issue of resource allocation. We would all, each of us, love to be able to do everything and do it all perfectly and know everything and notice everything. That's just not possible. We are limited human beings. We have finite resources. We can only do so many things. In that question right there, they're only doing things. They aren't accomplishing they want. They aren't accomplishing the task they want to until night because they keep getting some questions about that language. A, what is the problem with them getting it accomplished at the night? With just the information of there are some things I'm wanting to accomplish and I accomplish them at night, that in and of itself reveals no inherent problem. Now, there obviously is some problem. So when I'm asking what's the problem, I don't mean to say there's no problem here. I'm saying I haven't gotten enough information to understand what the problem is. Why is it bad that they're getting it done at night? Is there some benefit if they were getting it done earlier? Or sometimes the answer to that is, well, it doesn't cause an actual problem in their life. It's not that it would have been better to do it earlier. It's just that they thought it would be better to do it earlier, or they intended to do it earlier. And then the fact that they're doing it later, they perceive as an indication of like, what is wrong with me? Here's a fun little thing. Focus and distraction. I do intend to come back to motivation here in this conversation, assuming that things keep going that way. Focus and distraction are not observable things, right? Meaning, if I am playing a video game and then I remember I'm supposed to do my homework, and so I stop playing the video game and do my homework, would you say that I got distracted by doing my homework? You think it's that? It is often that, but I try to be careful about that because that is too close to what's the problem here, sounding like there is no problem here. Why I'm trying to be so clear about what is the problem is not about justifying or proving that there's a problem. It's about being specific. Here's a very common thing that's closely related to this that comes up all the time. People will say, I keep procrastinating my homework. I put everything off until the last minute. Now, neither of those things have enough information contained in them to tell me why this is an issue. Procrastinating, like distraction, is a word that's referring to how we view something. Distraction means there's something that I have intended to do or have determined is or would be the best or most beneficial thing for me to do that I'm supposed to do, whatever. something that is the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. If during the time I'm supposed to be doing that thing, anything else is, I do anything else instead, then that other thing is a distraction. Distraction comes from the same root as tractor, right? It means to pull. Tract means to pull. Attraction. Distraction means to pull away from. So distraction literally means just anything that is pulling me away from the identified task. So anything that pulls me away from this is a distraction. When we focus on the idea being that I am distractible, or that the distraction is the thing that's pulling me away, we're focusing on the wrong issue, and you'll end up chasing your tail a lot there. Same thing when we focus on procrastination as though it is an indication of a personality trait or some ongoing characteristic. Procrastination doesn't mean anything about me. Procrastination just means there's something I intended to do at a particular time. When that time arrived, I didn't do it or am not doing it, putting it off. Another thing that procrastination often refers to is putting things off till the last minute, doing things right before the deadline. And that also is not inherently a problem. In fact, and I'm going to say something here that most people listening to this might object to. Generally speaking, academic writing assignments, the optimal time to do those things is at the last minute. The reason that you're not doing those things well in advance is because that is a suboptimal time to be doing that stuff. Now, part of the reason that people might object to that is because they've been told that that's not accurate, that they should be doing things early. Part of the reason people might object to that is because they have experienced many things that prove that it would have been better to do it early. Meaning, things happen that had they done it earlier wouldn't have been a problem. One of the most common of those is I started at the last minute and then I don't finish it at time. What I would say is, then that's not the last minute. And there is a problem there. The problem there is that you are misevaluating what the last minute is. Starting at the last minute means starting at the last possible moment where I will have enough resources and opportunities to be able to accomplish the thing before the deadline. If I start, quote unquote, at the last minute and can't complete it before the deadline, I didn't start at the last minute. I started after the last minute. And a very important skill is to identify, to be able to evaluate what actually is the last minute. Because if an assignment I think is going to take me 2 hours, and so I start at 2 hours before it's due, very rarely am I going to complete it in that time, because time is not the relevant metric. And I hope to hit on that here in a minute. We overfocus on time. Why would you say that it's more advantageous to start at the last minute? Good question. Because that's another skill that we want to work on developing for ourselves and for others, is to be able to identify what is a skill that is best to do at the last minute versus what is a skill that is best to do early on. Things that identify that it's quite likely or possible that this task would be better to do at the last minute. First of all, in order to be able to say that there's a last minute at all, we're talking about tasks that have a deadline. A deadline is a point in time after which, if the task has not been completed, some problem arises, either in a binary sense, like if I miss the deadline, I'm done, or in an escalating sense, like after the deadline, you lose 1% or one letter grade off for every day late, and it gets worse and worse. So this is not not me trying to reduce stigma or anything like that. This is a categorical definition. Some things, there's not a time coming up where if I haven't accomplished it by that time, now some new problem arises or some problem worsens. Some things would be beneficial to do, but they'd be beneficial to do it 2 weeks from now, a year from now, whenever, at any point they would be beneficial to do, especially ongoing maintenance tasks. So first, we're talking about things with deadlines. We're talking, in addition to having a deadline, if it is something that has been assigned to you by another person, meaning not something that you are doing for your own sake, like for your own enjoyment or something that you have come to on your own, but has been assigned to you, that makes it more likely that it's better to do by the deadline, because typically in that case, the deadline is determined by the person who assigned it to you. Meaning, theoretically, the deadline has been chosen with the idea in mind that you will have the time and resources and whatever are necessary. It's not always the case, but theoretically, you will be able to get it done by the deadline. Usually means that the deadline is externally enforced as well. It is not something that you inherently enjoy doing. That one's an important one. One of the reasons that it is more advantageous to start at, I'll come back to that one because I want to say that one second, because if I say it first. Is there something worse about finishing stuff early? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and even in that case, it's still better to do it at the last minute. So sometimes there's something worse about finishing stuff early because two things. After I'm done with it, if we really mean finish it, right? Like I'm done and I'm not coming back to it anymore. Let's use a writing assignment as an example. If it's assigned 2 months before it's due and I finish it after 2 weeks, I work on it for 2 weeks and then I'm done. Well, then what we mean by that is I'm not coming back to it. I'm finished, right? Yeah, go ahead and ask a question. It's finished. I'm not coming back to it. Well, in the remaining 6 weeks between when I'm finished and I didn't come back to it and when it was due, I am going to learn a lot more stuff. I'm going to get a lot more information. I'm going to, even if there's nothing else going on, then just in the process of having thought about and done what I did on those first 2 weeks and thinking about it as I move forward, I'm going to get more and more and more ideas that I'm losing access to. So the product I would produce at the last minute is better than the one that I am done with 6 weeks before it is due. Second, even if that's not the case, if it is something with an objective criteria when it's completed, it doesn't get better or worse or whatever, then instead what I'm missing out on is increased efficiency. It costs me more to do it in the first 2 weeks when I know less and have less practice than it would if I did it in the same time frame, but on the final 2 weeks as opposed to the initial 2 weeks. Now, with writing assignments and with a lot of this stuff like that in general, part of the issue is that nobody finishes it early. That's not true. That doesn't happen. You can start it early, but if you start the day after it's assigned and you have 2 months to complete it, you are quite likely going to be coming back to it and working on it and revising it until the last minute anyway. That's often a problem of the completion criteria has not been identified. You don't have an objective way to look at the thing and say, yep, this is done, I'm out. Quite often, the completion criteria is identified by the person giving the assignment, but the student who's reading the assignment is not treating that as actual completion criteria, right? It says, quote 3 sources, give 2 current perspectives and rebut 1 other, blah, 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 right? It tells you exactly how to go about it. You got to use this many citations. But what I'm actually trying to do is write a good paper, which is not defined. So I'm treating that as a baseline of I've got to do at least this stuff, but then on top of that, I've got to write a good paper. If I'm doing something like that, then I can't ever really say that I'm finished. In fact, the phrase do your best works against us here, because my best, it would have been better if I spent more time on that. So people will start these kinds of tasks early sometimes, but it is very, very rare that they finish early, so back to these identifying some things about that make it likely that starting at the last minute is optimal is, are there clear completion criteria? If so, then starting it earlier and finishing it earlier can be beneficial. If not, it's almost never better to do it earlier, because you will just keep doing it until the deadline. The completion criteria is the deadline. I'm done when it has to be turned in. If I start 2 months in advance, I'm putting in 2 months of work. If I start 2 days in advance, I'm putting in 2 days of work. Now that does come back to how do I know when is the last minute that I'll have enough time to do an effective job? But we can come back to that. So that's one of the reasons that it can be worse to finish stuff early. Another one is you never know what changes. As a very extreme example, this is one of the reasons that checking is this something that is inherently beneficial to you? As a very extreme example, you could die, right? If you're doing something that isn't inherently enjoyable or beneficial, but only because of what it earns you later, that doesn't mean it's not valuable to do. But if you got hit by a bus, are you glad that you spent the 2 weeks doing that it didn't turn out needed to be done? Now, I'm not saying that we should take that into consideration intellectually in deciding when and how to do these things. I'm saying that this is an explanation for why it works out that way. As a general rule, if we're talking about something where people generally or commonly do it at the last minute, there are reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is because the systems, our executive functioning, that allocates resources are operating on top of all of these premises, taking all this information into account. Anything that's only good because it pays off later and has a deadline is optimal to do at the last moment, because if you do it before that, it might turn out that you wasted your resources. As a less extreme example, but a very, I think, actual real one, I was working with plenty of people when the COVID pandemic first began in the United States back in 2020. Plenty of people who had all these big assignments that got canceled and nothing needed to be turned in. And if any of them, or for any of them who had done that stuff early and then later found out, that was wasted effort. But again, that's more likely to be the case for something that was assigned to you by somebody else, because that is less likely to have some intrinsic benefit. Now, stuff that indicates that it's better to start it earlier is something where iteration is beneficial. You want to be able to have the opportunity to make as many different attempts, try different things as possible. Something else is that if it is inherently enjoyable and or inherently beneficial to you, regardless of any external assignment or deadline, because then the act of doing it is in and of itself beneficial to you. If it has clear completion criteria, meaning you can finish it, know you're finished, be done, and move on to the next task, instead of just continuing to edit and revise over and over. And anything that you're trying to fully, not internalize, what's the word I'm looking for? Integrate. Meaning a lot of the stuff, especially when we're talking about academics, and I'm just using that because I haven't had other specific examples thrown out in academics is commonly what we're talking about. A lot of the stuff that you're doing when you're studying for a test is not stuff that you're actually trying to integrate that information into your like long-term memory and code it for later use. You're just trying to get that knowledge well enough that you can utilize it for the upcoming task. And then if you remember it or not after that, it doesn't matter. But if and when there are things that you do really want to be able to remember, understand in ways that make it so that you can access and utilize it throughout day-to-day life, or relatively frequently for the rest of your life, that's when spaced repetition becomes very, very important. I just wish I'd been able to finish more papers in time to stop in my professor's office hours to talk about it before turning it in. Oh, I missed so many opportunities to learn more because of being unable to make progress on a thing without an externally enforced deadline. Okay, good point. And right, there are individual specific reasons for different things that it might be better to shift doing it forward or later. Although I will say in this particular case, while that is sometimes actually true, what is often the case is you could have stopped into your professor's open office hours even though you hadn't made progress on it. And in fact, stopping into your professor's open office hours before having made progress on it would have helped you to be able to either make a lot more progress on it from that point, or at least to stop stressing quite about it so much. That is most likely. Specific professors and specific policies are different, but generally speaking, that's more likely to be an issue of I'm embarrassed about the fact that I haven't done something and therefore am not allowing myself to avail myself of something like going to something that I think would be enjoyable or beneficial. I'm not doing because I'm embarrassed of something. So in that case, doing it earlier isn't going to solve the problem. Quite literally, in your case, it didn't solve the problem, right? You believed that doing it earlier would be beneficial. You still didn't do it earlier, and you missed out on that stuff. Where had we been able to change it so that you understand that even though you haven't done it or made progress on it earlier, you could still do it. In fact, one of the most commonly helpful things for this specific example is to contact the professor. Quite frequently, the issue here is that the person who's intending to do the assignment doesn't actually understand how to do the assignment. They understand it on a certain level, right? They got the assignment, they took the notes, or they have the assignment page or whatever. They understand it in the sense of, I know I'm supposed to write a paper about such and such and such and such, but they don't understand it on the depth of level of like, does this source count as a good source? Or exactly how should I be structuring this? Or what kind of tone and language should I be using? And they stall out. One of the reasons that I'm talking about if it's externally assigned is because that makes it likely that the assessment of whether it's done well or not is up to whoever assigned it externally, which means when you're writing an academic paper, the person who decides whether or not that paper is good is the professor you're turning it into. So you can understand what's written on the page, go to write it, and still get stuck thinking like, what does my professor want me to be doing or saying here? Would they like this point or this way of wording it? And the more you talk to and interact with the professor, the better it will be. In my particular case, I think it was pretty brave going into office hours, even when I hadn't made a lot of progress. It would have helped me to make a lot more progress earlier, because then when specific questions came up, I would have had time to talk them through. Good. Okay. Good point. Now, that's all talking about how to identify when doing something at the last minute might be more advantageous. And there's plenty more we can talk about there. But now we're going to move on to, let's assume that we have gotten to a point where we're accepting that this is something that would be better to do at the last minute. The thing that people are mostly thinking of when they think doing it at the last minute is like the night before or a couple hours before. What we're actually trying to talk about is the last point at which you can start while still having all of the available resources and opportunities to do whatever it is you're attempting to do by the deadline. So that means that if, for example, part of what you're going to need or want to be doing in order to accomplish this task before the deadline is to be able to talk to the professor after having written 2 pages or whatever example we're coming up with, then figuring out what the last minute is involves writing those first 2 pages or however much you need to complete before it would be beneficial to talk to the professor at a point at which you can still talk to the professor when you hit that point. Last minute, I've been using that phrase because that comes up. But when we're actually doing this work with people, I'm trying to get people to use different ways of thinking about this, because last minute prioritizes time. And just without getting into a ton of detail about it, I'll say time is not a resource. It is not the accurate or not the optimal metric to utilize. It gets in the way a lot because it's a space holder. People talk about time management, for example. That's literally one of the things that is often discussed as executive functioning. What does that mean? You can't save up time. You can't spend it at a faster rate when it's important or beneficial to use it all at once. You don't manage time. We're using that concept as a shorthand. What we're talking about is you have limitations. You are a person, you have a body, you can only do so many things at any given moment. Doing something in one moment doesn't prevent you from doing any other thing in that moment, right? At any given moment, your heart is beating and you're breathing and you're doing this and you're, but there are limits to how many things. You can't breathe and hold a note at the same time when you're singing, right? So what we're talking about is behavior management. And mostly what is the relevant, resource there is, we don't have time to get into the details, but it's what we're going to call energy as a shorthand. Every single time when somebody's saying, I keep intending to do this thing at this time, and when that time comes, I don't do the thing. There is always a reason for that. Sometimes the reason is because at that time, there's some other thing that has come up. You've made a valiant effort to plan when would be optimal to do this thing, but by the time that rolled around, new information has come up, and now actually there's this other thing that takes precedence. So that's one thing that can happen. What about setting personal deadlines and missing them? I feel like I try to do this and it almost makes me feel like the task is even less possible, but also no deadline is anxiety inducing too. With few exceptions, which unfortunately we don't have time to get into today, but maybe next week or in the future. With few exceptions, setting what you're referring to as personal deadline does not help and does make the problem worse. You cannot fool yourself. A deadline, that's why I defined it the way I defined it. It's a time at which, if the task has not been accomplished by that time, some problem comes into being. You being mad at yourself for having missed a deadline is not a real problem. You're already mad at yourself for the way you're going about doing this, or you wouldn't have tried setting that deadline in the first place. That plays into motivation, which I'm not going to have time to get to today, unfortunately, but come back and we'll talk about it next time. Back to, where was I? Last minute. Oh, resources. One of the reasons that 7 o'clock rolls around and I intend to do this thing and I don't is because there is some tool or external resource that I need access to that I don't have, right? I need to get 6 citations for this thing, and I need to get into the library to get a physical piece of media, and the library is closed and I can't do that. Crap. Or a very common one again is, I know I have to write this paper. When I actually sit down to write it, I look over it. I'm like, oh shoot, I didn't realize there was that particular thing, and I'm not sure what that means. And I need to find out I need to get clarification from the professor, but now it's 2 o'clock in the morning and it's due in 6 hours and they're not going to respond to me, blah, blah, blah. So last minute doesn't mean literally in a hypothetical world in which the context was exactly perfect and no other things came up, how long would it take me to do this thing? And that's what the last minute is. Last minute, we're talking about in the real world in which I have to take into account how predictable are things that come up. For some people, pretty easy to say, like, yeah, I know from this time to this time, nothing else is going to drop on my plate, or I'm highly confident that it won't. For other people, it's like, look, stuff pops up on me all the time. If that's the case, then your last minute needs to start earlier to accommodate for the fact that stuff pops up on you all the time, right? But energy management. So if I'm going to do it and I don't have access to tool or information or external resource that I need in order to be able to do it, that's a reason that I might not do it when the time arrives. Another one is because even though I've set the time aside and I do have it free and I have the external tools and resources available, I don't have the energy necessary to do this thing right now, right? If I plan to run a mile at 3 a.m., it's quite likely that by 3 a.m., even if I have that time free, I'm just not going to have the energy in me to be able to do it at that time where I could have done it at some other time. And people don't pay attention to energy because of motivation. And I didn't do all this fast enough to be able to get back to talking about motivation. But I'll say this quickly. Motivation means a bunch of different things, but most commonly we use it to mean one of two things. We say motivation to mean incentive, meaning I got to motivate my employees to blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm incentivizing them to do that, right? Setting that personal deadline for yourself, that example that you just used, you're trying to incentivize yourself to do the thing by that time, because if you don't, theoretically, you'll be mad at yourself or feel bad about yourself or whatever. The other thing that we commonly mean is energy, right? Like, oh, I wanted to do this thing, but when the time came, I just wasn't motivated, couldn't get myself motivated to do it. Motivated, the root words of that is about like putting things into motion. It really is very closely related to energy. Energy management is important and people don't pay attention to it because we think of motivation as, we use it to mean those two things, but what we think that it means, what we think of it as is the way we think about something. So what will happen is I don't have the energy in me to be able to do task X right now, which I am reading as I'm not feeling motivated, which is, it's how we use language. So it's an accurate way to state it. Then what do I do about it? What we're trying next is I got to get motivated. But rather, if I was thinking about it as energy, I'd think of that as I got to rest or recuperate or eat or do something that gets me energy. If instead I'm thinking of it as motivation, then I'll tend to think all I need to do is think about it right. I need to want it more, care more. And I'll get in this cycle where I'm trying in my mind to be like, come on, let's do it. Come on. This is really important. I'm getting really stressed. I'm beating myself up in my head to try to incentivize myself to do this thing, because the worse I'm beating myself up in my head, the more important it is to do it, the better things will be if I do it, because I can stop all that. That's incentive. But it doesn't provide any additional energy. So I still don't have the resources necessary to pay the cost that it takes to do the thing. This is where we get into what I call the accomplishment equation and dealing with the fact that things have costs to them. Human beings are not magical. We don't break the laws of the physical universe. Nobody would say, hey, go run until you collapse out of exhaustion. And then if you want it badly enough, you can just get up and keep running. Or if they do, they wouldn't say, okay, and then when you collapse out of exhaustion again, 10 feet further on, you can keep doing that indefinitely. Everybody understands that there is a limit at which it doesn't matter how bad you want to do it. You can literally be a matter of life or death, and you just can't keep going, and you die. People die. I'm using a very dramatic example, a physical example. The mind is the same thing. Cognition is the same thing. There are limits. There are limits past which you cannot push, no matter what you think, no matter how important something is to you. And we have a lot of wiggle room to play with. There's a lot of room between, I don't really feel like doing this thing right now, even though I do think it will be helpful and beneficial, and I am literally not capable of doing this thing in this moment. But that wiggle room is what we're talking about. We can talk about that stuff as surplus resources or not, right? Meaning, if I'm at a point where I theoretically do have access to the resources, the energy, and the whatnot to be able to do this right now, but I'm not feeling motivated. Well, that means that that's an indication that if I were to spend the resources necessary to do this thing right now, I am pulling those resources away from something else that they're spoken for. My middle school teacher's favorite poem was If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. Yeah, and some other time we can talk about how this plays into various elements of our culture. But for executive functioning purposes, here's the thing. If what you are observing happen does not align with what you think should happen, then your thoughts are the ones that are wrong and are in need of change, not the what you observed happen is wrong is in need of change. If I think I should be able to do homework for 4 hours, but consistently I can do it for an hour and a half and then I stop over and over and over, then the truth is that my belief that I should be able to do it for 4 hours is inaccurate, not that there's something wrong with what I'm doing. And that theoretically changes could be made to accomplish that same amount of work, even in a similar time frame. We could look at some things we could change, different supports and arrangements and accommodations, right? Sometimes not, but sometimes there's stuff that will work for that. But what tends to happen is people get stuck, especially with the deficit models, part of why I focus on neurodiversity so much. People get stuck with this idea of, I should be able to X, and every time I attempt to, I fail to do that. And I never question that I should be able to do X. So I mostly am just theorizing about what is wrong with me, what is the deficiency of mine that is making it so that I can't do X, or that I'm not or failing to do X that I should be able to do. And executive functioning often gets talked about in that way as an answer to that question. I should be able to do this thing. I am doing this other thing instead, or doing it in this other way instead. What's wrong with me? Oh, I have executive dysfunction. That's not what executive functioning is. It's about resource allocation. And that's not to say that it's not important to do that thing. And it's not to say that there aren't things where it is beneficial for us to just make ourselves. In fact, I really got to get wrapping up, but I'll say this. This idea that motivation, that getting your thoughts in order should precede taking action, that you should know how to do something before attempting it. Remember, the point is you attempt it because you think it might work, not because you are confident that it will work. That is, to me, this idea people put out there about like, oh, everybody just wants to do whatever they want to do and nobody's willing to work hard, and sometimes you have to push through. I agree with that idea. But what that really means is that there are times where like you're afraid to do something, or you think you don't know how to do something, and you can just do it anyway. It isn't about you don't have the energy or the resources necessary to do something and you can do it anyway, which is how other people are interpreting it often. And that ends up with people thinking, well, once I get my mind right, once I get motivated, once I think in the right way, then the actions will just happen automatically, which is sometimes true, rarely though in these kinds of things that we're talking about, where people are struggling to get these things done. Mostly what happens is you just have to go at a certain point. Your thoughts, your whatever is not going to get to the place where you're saying like, yeah, I want to do this thing now. It is important and helpful and beneficial to do things in the moment that we are not feeling like will be enjoyable to do. Enjoyment isn't the only thing that matters, at least not in, immediate enjoyment is not the only thing that matters, definitely. But we have to look at there is a difference between I'm afraid that this will fail, and therefore I don't want to try until I have a better idea that I'm confident will succeed. There's a difference between that and I literally cannot afford to pay the cost to do this thing right now without hampering my ability to pay some other important cost later. No one would question if you have $1,000 in your bank account and you want to do something even very important and beneficial that costs $200, and you say, I can't afford it. No one would be like, yeah, you have the money in your account when you have to pay your rent that costs $1,000 the next day. Everybody understands, like, just because you have it in the account doesn't mean it is a surplus resource for you to be able to be. It can be spoken for. So yes, you do technically have the energy. You're not a dead person in that moment. But there are other things, and we're isolating these things and evaluating them one-on-one. So best of like broad general advice I can give about executive functioning is Focus much, much more than you currently are on observing what is happening. Get information about what does happen, right? I do this and then this thing happens. If I say, like, what did you do? And you say, nothing. I haven't been doing anything. That is an inaccurate answer. You're always doing something. Almost always people who are having executive functioning issues are over focusing on the things that they've identified as productive or important or necessary and neglecting the rest. And the rest of that stuff happens for a reason, even if you don't think that it should. Just like you can think that you shouldn't have to sleep and that you should be able to just continue to be productive nonstop without ever having to stop to sleep. You can think that. It will not work out that way. And you can call sleep a distraction, and you can say that it is a character flaw of yours or any other kind of a thing. But there's a reason that you sleep. It fulfills a particular function. The things you're referring to as distractions, the times you're talking about procrastinating, those things are serving functions, and you're ignoring that. And the fact that you're ignoring it likely means, almost always these people, that those of you who are here, me, myself, almost always these people are actually doing more than the average person is doing. That's part of why these problems end up becoming longer and bigger problems over time, because you've identified that you should be able to do more than you're currently doing. So you push yourself to do as much as possible, which is by definition more than is sustainable. That's why you're struggling to do it that much. So you're going into debt, you're damaging yourself and worsening the problem over time. It gets worse and worse and worse. This is how we end up with people who are saying things like, I just can't get anything done. While from the outside, we can point out, like, well, you got straight A's and you are employed at a very, you're paid quite a bit of money to do your job, and everybody at your job thinks you're doing well. A lot of imposter syndrome stuff is related to this, right? You're in a position where everybody else has no problem with what you're doing. They think you're doing a good job. You're being paid well for it. And you're saying, no, but nobody understands how, like, I don't really know what I'm doing and how much this costs me. That's all true, and it's understandable. And that's a resource allocation issue. If you think that you should be able to fly through the air just by willing yourself to fly through the air, you're going to feel really terrible about the fact that you can't do that. If you think everybody else does it and that everyone else does it easily, you're going to feel even worse about not being able to do it. And you're going to dedicate a lot of your resources to trying to figure out how to do that. And those resources are wasted because you're wrong. That's not possible. And you're throwing good money after bad, chasing something that isn't real. There is no such thing as unlimited productivity. There's no such thing as a person who always remembers every single thing they're supposed to do and gets it done. We have tons of research on to-do lists, for example, that show that using a to-do list not only does not help, it actually makes the problem worse for everybody, not just people with ADHD. Anyone using a to-do list, it makes the problems worse. There are reasons for this, and it's understandable why people think it would be beneficial. It makes sense why people think that. We also then tell each other that, and we're told that, and that's part of why we continue to think that it would be beneficial, but that doesn't change the reality. So start with the observation. What is happening? For example, I intend to do my homework as soon as I get home from school, but I don't end up doing it until 10 o'clock. Well, if over a long period of time you keep trying to do it at 4 o'clock and you're doing it at 10 o'clock, the very first thing I'm going to suggest is, well, is there any particular problem or reason that doing it at 10 o'clock is a bad thing to do, other than that your belief is it would be better to do it at 4? Yeah, I stress about it until it gets done. Okay, well, what if theoretically we could change things so that you don't stress about it? Is there any external problem? What if you planned on doing it at 10 o'clock, and instead of spending 6 hours thinking that you were doing a terrible job, you would just spend that 6 hours doing whatever other thing, and then knowing I'm going to do it at 10 o'clock. If you planned on that and it wasn't stressful, would you still get it done at 10 o'clock? And we'll try that. And it works. And there's no other external problem with it. Problem solved. Let's move on to the next one. So false correlation, the idea that stress and pressure makes me do stuff. No, the reason that I do things at the last minute is because the deadline is coming up. The reason I didn't do it at the very beginning is because it is suboptimal to do it at the very beginning. I can make up a narrative about it's only because I wasn't feeling stressed and then I did it more. That's coincidental. I can tell you firsthand, and also with many, many, many clients, we can shift things so that you don't stress and feel guilty and pressured about stuff, anxious about stuff, and still do it at the exact same time. That's a false correlation. It is true that you are getting more stressed as time goes on, but that's not why you started it. We know what stress is. Stress does not help you accomplish cognitively oriented tasks. It helps you accomplish physical tasks at the cost of some damage and work that needs to be repaired at a later date. That's the point of adrenaline and those different things. It's borrowing from the future to surpass our sustainable capabilities in the moment. I'm keeping the Monterey Bay Aquarium Live Sea Otter Cam up at work lately. It's been helping me get spell slots back when I keep glancing over and seeing an otter bump headfirst into another otter and just shake it off. Great. I love that. And generally, not very many people would come to a conclusion where, like, that's a thing that can help with your executive functioning. But it is, right? The things you have identified as executive dysfunction, those problems are getting better. They're happening less frequently or whatever as you started doing that and continue to do that. There are all kinds of solutions. It's actually quite fun and easy to come up with individualized solutions to people's executive functioning issues if we come at it with this correct understanding that it is about resource allocation. What things do you do that generate or replenish your resources? What things take those resources from you? What of that is biological? What of that is about time of day? What of that is about what other things you're doing? What of that is about how you're thinking about things? And we play around with all these little things to get where we want to go. So we can say general things like, how do I become a great basketball player? Practice. Good answer, very general. For an individual person, it doesn't give them much to go off of. Same with executive functioning, right? How do I get better? Start with observation of what is happening and adjust your theories and your understandings to match the observation rather than vice versa. Try new things that you think might be worth trying, knowing that they are likely to fail. But the more rapidly you come up with and try new things and take that feedback and iterate and move on to new theories instead of getting stuck on the same failed theory, the better things will go. The more mindful practice where you identify that theory, observe the feedback, like we said, and the more expert feedback that you get, people who know more about what to do, talking to the professor, etc., hiring a coach, sure, whatever, expert feedback to get. And then the more you attempt things, the better things will get, the more quickly. I'll talk about more specifics some other time. This is very fun. Thank you all for being here. So much participation in the chat. I very much appreciate it. Thanks. This was really helpful. Giving me a new perspective. It's giving me some ideas to try for my own executive functioning difficulties. Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad for that. Please come back. We're here every Monday at 1 to 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Happy to get into more specifics about your particular things that you're working on. Would love to hear more about ideas and how attempts have gone. But yeah, thank you. Thank you, all of you, Bass Insider, Mimi and Evie, Liv, everybody who participated in the chat today. I appreciate it. We'll see you next week.